okay, this is the kind of monism that I'm interested in. It's one, Bradley realized that you can't arbitrarily restrict it to whatever you think of is as concrete. You can't treat a method already up front as the right way to solve this question. You can't separate questions of what exists from questions of what the nature of truth is. You can't separate the notion of a concrete world of objects separate from our experience as subjects, and the ways in which we as subjects are also part of that world. And I thought, yeah, monism is one of these. Monism or pluralism was a question that's too fundamental to have it extricated and separated from every other question and sort of popped on the table and looked at independently, as though the presuppositions you bring to it don't matter.
Recently, I had the opportunity to discuss the philosophy of idealism, the idea that mind is the fundamental essence of reality, with Dr. Nathan Hawkins, a YouTuber and also a lecturer at Cambridge University. He was able to come on and help us celebrate a small milestone that we've passed here on the channel. That is all thanks to you. And yeah, I organised this so that we could do something a little bit different, but that meant I had to keep up, and I've done my best. I think we've had an interesting conversation. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he puts forward, but being a non-dual thinker, there is a lot of shared ground. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy it, and here it is.
You know, I just think that logic is already including things like sets in the semantics of it, including all these sort of assumptions. How are we supposed to get a logic that has a clean metaphysical starting point that doesn't kind of stack the deck one way or the other? And I was told first order logic is completely metaphysically neutral. First order logic is the stuff you learn in first year. You just have objects and properties you can say things of. I knew that wasn't true. I knew first order logic clearly was already burdened with a lot of metaphysical assumptions. So anyway, I looked at Bradley, and it made me realize that, yeah, if you take the subjective experience you have seriously, if you want to make sense of the nature of truth and how we know things, not just how things are, but how we could possibly know them to be so, I think you very quickly get sucked into an idealist position. Yeah. The problem is if you start off your way of making sense of the world already taking a leap outside of your own skin across the chasm to some concrete material world, it's almost impossible to get back subjectivity. That's always been the problem. That's right. The hard problem of consciousness. That's the issue of trying to make free will cohere with a purely scientific view of the world. It's a problem of getting knowledge and truth as well.
So have you found that with these monist theories that they're always trying to offer a monism from a logical point of view, or a monism that is separate from the first person perspective, that's separate from the idea of experience, that the experience is something that is then additory to that whole idea of what the one thing is?
So the contemporary versions do, but because the sorts I've been talking about, so Schaffer and Horgan-Paterk kinds of monisms do, they sort of immediately treat the concrete or the physical world as something is just given. Yeah. You can then theorize about that in a way that is supposedly isolated from other issues.
And these are all 20th century thinkers, or is this?
These are currently writing
21st century
philosophers. Yeah, exactly. And there are those that disagree with them. So Ted Sider, who's another eminent philosopher, was writing back against Schaffer and monism and so on. So it was like a live debate. So it was an obvious one for me to get involved with. Yeah. But I just found it incredibly dissatisfying. I found it incredibly restricted because it was like the concrete world is one. Oh, but there are also sets and abstract numbers, and their logical system itself was outside of what would be one. And so, but however, what I was going to say is that I was looking to do further research on this back in New Zealand, where my wife is from, and I was living for a long time. And there's a chap there who's very sympathetic to what I was doing, and he had spoke to Horgan at a conference, because I'd been sharing with this chap, Joe Ultowski, he's a good guy, that I thought the arguments that Horgan and Paterk were deploying to say that the concrete world was actually just a blobject, they were using issues, they're relatively technical arguments, that's why it's quite hard to explain on YouTube, but It's to do with how our words could really pick out something isolated. So there's lots of words that are what we call vague. So being bald is one of these terms that it's not obvious whether you are or aren't. So there are all these paradoxes that arise from this. And they were sort of arguing that they actually arise for all of our terms, that all of our terms have vague boundaries, and so there is no hard cutoff point for anything.
Right. I would agree with that. I would agree with that particular statement. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so they're technical arguments that you can run, and I think there's a lot to be said about them. I mean, same with an object, the cat. Okay, so are hairs slightly dislocated from the skin part of the cat or not? What about the flakes of skin? Is that part of the cat or not? What about the food that's digesting in the cat's stomach? Is that part of the cat or not? When you start to try to draw a hard boundary about what is the cat and what isn't the cat,
yeah, exactly,
you have these same problems. And
that's right. You end up with an infinite regress every time you try to create an absolute boundary. Yeah,
you end up with fuzzy boundaries. And then the thing is, unless you think reality is fuzzy, which most people don't, then it's hard to then say that there is sort of a fact of the matter. Anyway, so there are ways in which it's tried to be solved. There's something called supervaluationism in bits and pieces. Williamson is supervaluation.
Yeah.
But I just thought this is playing maths with these questions to me. I mean, I understood it. I liked it. I teach logic, but and in some ways, there's something fun about trying to solve a puzzle where there's
so you've landed on a monism yourself. But you've landed on a monism that is rooted in mind first.
Yeah, so I'll tell you why in a bit. So,
okay, great.
So yeah, I said to Ulatowski that the arguments that these people are putting forward for their monism would also apply to the distinction between the concrete and the abstract, would also apply to the distinction between an object and a property, would also apply ultimately to the object-subject distinction, the difference between me and my environment and everything. And he said, interestingly, he spoke to Horgan at a conference and said that to him. And that, well, I mean, this is, I guess, becoming public now, but this is at least what I was told. And Horgan basically said, yeah, I think you're right. I think that is where it goes. I just don't want to think about it. So we're not. So it's almost like, it's sort of like, it leads, because once you do that, then you don't really have a concrete world separate to our way of conceiving of it. It's not independent of, the world outside is not independent of the way we think about it.
No, that's right.
And or independent of the way we experience it.
Yes.
And it's this sort of thing that I think then leads to an idealistic conception. Now, in some ways, you could say it's really neutral in that it's neither mind nor non-mind and matter, because the distinction is between the two. It's sort of gone. However, I think that's correct. But if we're going to try to talk about the nature of things in a way that makes sense, I find the idea of matter, which is something we're supposed to have had no experience of, that we have to posit as a theoretical thing, is something we have no real conception of. We kind of know what mind is, or at least the word mind can refer to this experience.
Well, I think what you said just then was super important, because you laid out right from the start that even if because this is that was going to be exactly my question to you. If you're going to have mind as the ontological primitive of this model, can you give that an absolute definition? Can you say that this is what mind is and this is where it starts and this is where it ends? Or if it doesn't end, what is its characteristics separate from the things that we're discussing? But you said at the start that it's almost in a superposition of being mind and not mind, or you could say it's mind and matter, but you're preferring the mind description of it.
But I think there's an asymmetry there, because I think the difference is that what gets erased is your conceptual category between mental entities and physical entities. That goes.
Yes.
So in some ways then, the kind of basic nature of everything, the underlying substance, we know mind by acquaintance. We have no acquaintance with matter. If I know what matter is, it's supposed to be that thing outside me that has some causal relation with my experiences. However, mind is the thing that we swim in. When I talk about mind, I'm talking about the sum total of our experiences, our felt experience, our thought experience, our volitional experience, and what what we do, all of these things, that's the goldfish bowl in which we're swimming. That's what we're acquainted with. That's what we have this direct and immediate engagement with. And then if everything is one, then everything must be that, and everything must be explained in terms of that. And I think that includes truth and things like that, because basically, to get outside of experience, often what's appealed to is truth. That we recognize there are some things that we think that are true, some things that we think that are false, and the claim is that there is some reality independent of our thought that is a certain way, and it's the way that reality is that makes what we think true or false. And then what we do is we kind of say that's where reality is. Reality is over there, and we try to copy it in our thinking.
Exactly, and I think that's the first part that's fairly easy to dismiss. You can sort of even just through a physical lens, we know that qualities like color or even texture and hardness, none of those actually exist beyond the interpretation of the first person experience. They don't exist in any real world. The Kantian things in themselves, they don't necessarily have to hold any relationship to the things that we're in our experience, those particular qualities. So we're able to realize that there is a problem there that can be solved by saying that, by taking the mind as something that is primary and then going, okay, well, let's work from here outwardly. But the thing that kind of doesn't fully land with myself in terms of idealism is pretty much what you said at the start, that the idea of calling it mind, when we say mind, in terms of, you said just then that we need to be able to describe things coherently. We need to be able to discuss these things. So in doing that, we cut these finite shapes. We might be referring to number. We might be referring to an object. We might be talking about mind. But mind in itself is something that we associate a character to. We associate, usually it's like a summing of qualias that could be mind, and then there's the idea of the different types of minds for other sort of I don't like saying lower or lower systems. The idea of lower and higher is completely anti my whole metaphysical view, because the oneness in terms of the monism, in my understanding, has been sort of I reached it through a meditation on infinity, and it was basically looking for those boundaries, those borders, going, where do things end? And I would say the exact same thing about mind, that you go, well, where does mind stop being mind? And I think that the useful way of making that differentiation is that there's your mind, there's my mind, and then there's some sort of communication or correspondence happening between those two minds. Now, that correspondence, I wouldn't say is the world out there, but I think that attributing the term mind to that correspondence leaves a lot to be described. And I think you've discussed this idea a lot in terms of mind at large, and that's analytic idealism. But even if you take like Eastern philosophy, when they're talking about the idea of wholeness, there's a lot of points in the text where it'll say that everything is mind first, but then they'll go on to say that the idea of Brahman, or this wholeness, this non-duality, is something that goes beyond the idea of mind, or beyond the idea of this nameable attribute. And I think that's quite important. So how would you make sense if you to say that everything is mind? Okay, well, there was still some sort of happening prior to your mind. There was some sort of happening prior to my mind, because I'm arriving in a world that's already happening. So what is that happening? If it is considered mind, how is it different to our mind? And how is your current thinking different to the current theories that are out there?
Okay, well, I guess there's a lot in there. First I should say that, you're alluding to Kastrup and analytical idealism. I'm not a Kastrupian.
No.
I mean, I started off because everybody said, well, if you're an idealist, you need to read this guy, because he's the main guy. Well, I mean, he is not he's not really the main guy academically, so I hadn't come across him.
No, and I enjoyed your conversation with him. I was a little bit disappointed that he hadn't watched your critique when he first jumped on, and I was like, "Oh, that's okay, come on!" And I understand that. I totally understand that. But all of your points that you were making, I was like, exactly, and I was with you 100%. But this idea of this. If you're saying that everything is mind in a monist way of thinking, that everything is whole, but it's whole as a mind, then you still need to have that domain for correspondence, this God mind.
Yeah, of course. So okay, so let's start with this idea. Apart from a solipsist who thinks the only thing that exists is your own mind, then you have to explain intersubjectivity, and I think that's really what it is, more than objectivity. It's, you talk about communication, we talked about how we interact with other minds, so some kind of intersubjectivity, and also you alluded to something, although I'm not sure if you connected it with that issue, but I think it's related, which is this contemplation of boundary and the infinite. So once you recognize you need more than your own mind, the question then is, all right, and what is the nature of this further additional thing? And here you have a point of, is it more of the same stuff, more mind-like stuff, or is it something of a completely different nature that we can, in principle, never have an acquaintance with, because we are only ever acquainted with our own experience? This is something non-experiential.
Yeah.
And I think that when you understand the question that way, you realize that the only kind of conception we have is going to basically be experiential and then try and abstract out. So let me just go back to, you talked about qualia, you'd said things like, well, we know there aren't really colors and so on. Well, the idealist is going to say, but that's ridiculous. Of course there are colors. There must be colors. They're a fundamental part of my experience of the world. The reason you think there aren't colors when you do high school physics is because you're told that, well, we can explain colors using wavelengths and frequencies and so on. Now, and so therefore these colors arise just as a causal effect through your sense organs, and then gets interpreted by the brain, and you think you see colors, but there are actually no colors out there. Now, this idea is really old. I mean, this is from John Locke. It's even before Newton.
Yeah.
But the underlying principle is that the only things that really exist are those things you require in your explanations. Is that a reasonable thing to believe? Well, I just don't think it is.
No.
Secondly,
go on.
There's that.
Yep.
Secondly, it assumes that thought and language, which is part of mathematics, is a kind of language. Theories about the world are expressed linguistically in terms of laws. Everything that is can be described. Everything that exists can be captured in language. I don't think that's true. The Bradleyan move is to say, which I think if I explain to you his movements, will probably resonate with what you said is your own journey. So for him, we encounter the world, first of all, not in thought, but in feeling, in the given, this manifest immediate, what he calls immediate experience, this immediate direct encounter with reality. And in that immediate direct encounter with reality, which has been borne out in later philosophy of mind and in later psychology as well, this precognitive, the stage of encounter with the world that occurs before we can describe it, think about it, or theorize about it, which, by the way, is I have a 2-month-old daughter. That's the way she's encountering the world. She doesn't yet divide things up and categorize things and structure her experience. It's just all one. Even her own self, her own recognition of being a subject in the world isn't there yet, I don't think. And what you didn't want to call lower forms of life equally don't seem to have the idea of I am hungry. Instead, it's just hunger or whatever.
Correct, yes.
In this immediate encounter we have with the world, Bradley says the that and the what are combined. So what he means by that is the existence, the reality of the world is completely combined with the content, with its character. Now, what we do when we think about the world is we abstract the what from the that by drawing out the redness of the tomato and the shape of the thing. And then what we can do is construct that together linguistically to then think beyond the boundaries of that immediate experience, so we can predict what happens when I go out that door. I can tell you what I'm going to see, right? Because I have within my mind, in my thought, cognitive mind, a construction of the world around me. Now, what you do when you assume that there are no colors and so on, is you say that this world that we encounter in that immediate experience isn't the real world. The real world is the world that you're thinking about, reified as though it really exists. Then you run into all the problems of the fact that I can think about the world existing in a whole bunch of ways. Some of them are just ridiculous. If I thought I open that door and I'll see a dragon there, it will mismatch my experiences of going through that door. So then we have this idea of truth and falsity. The truth thoughts are those that, now what? If you take a realist point of view, truth is about there being this match between this independent world that's sort of thought like, it has objects, it has properties, and when I think true things, it's because they connect with that world. But I have no idea what that kind of world could genuinely be like. If you sit and think about it, all you have is language. All you have is your way of thinking.
Exactly.
And the correspondence theory assumes that that is the world itself, in itself. Now, to me, that doesn't actually play much of a role. The truth of the thoughts are the way in which they reconnect back with the world of immediate experience. So that if our world of thinking sort of harmonizes with our feeling, with the world of sense experience, but it's actually more than that. It does include our own internal feelings as well. The truth is in the reconnection of the thought and the felt. And give the last idea, which you talked about, as the boundary. This is where Bradley thinks then intersubjectivity comes in, or the world as a whole. He thinks that our immediate experience that's purely felt or known by acquaintance, part of that, we experience the finitude of the given. We experience the horizon. We experience the loss of our past experience and an anticipation for the future. So there's something in seed form in that immediate experience of the world, precognitive, before we start to describe things, that we feel the boundary. We feel the finitude and the limitations of our own experience. And we recognize that in thought, we're able to transcend that. I can look out the window, I can see the road, and it's only in my thinking that I can know, oh, well, that's where that road leads. If I want to go to the shop, I go down there, and so on. So I'm able to escape the boundary, escape the finitude of my immediate experience through thought in construction. And yet we also recognize the error of that. And also, he says, recognize that our thought world is not reality. It's lost the beingness, the reality essence of it. And so we're struggling now to put those together. We recognize that the boundary we try to transcend in thought, but thought isn't able to recapture the existence. And so truth is the attempt of improving thought to align with feeling in terms of coherence and comprehensiveness. And he thinks the end point then leads to the idea of there being a completion of that process, where there is an unbounded feeling that is entirely unified with thought. And he says that's the absolute. That's his conception of the absolute, where the distinction between truth and knowledge and being, and ultimately then the difference between thought and feeling and willing, are combined into one. So his is a very broad monism, but you never in any of that account. So that's where you get your intersubjectivity. That's where you get your objectivity, that we are all finite centers of experience, kind of positioned places of experience that we can connect in terms of thought, in the ways we try to construct and transcend those boundaries. We can't cross into each other. I can't experience your consciousness, like that's shut off from me.
Yeah.
But we can communicate in thought, because thought is the way in which that sort of pure individual subjectivity is transcended. But it's all part of a whole that is nothing over and above the experience, the felt experience, the thought experience, and also, we haven't talked about it much, but also will and volition.
I think that what I mean by correspondence is the idea that mind as we know it is very personal. It's an experience that we are able to name mind. We know what it feels like to have mind. We know that we assume, unless we're a solipsist, you've got your mind, I've got my mind. And then the idea, the way that I interpret the idealist way of thinking is that you have this broader field of mind, let's say, and that field, the only real quality it has is it's basically a place for the laws of the system, the way that we communicate with one another. So my words transfer from me to you. But does that make sense?
I think so. First of all, I should say that maybe your paradigm idealist is cast up a little bit too much. In that, I mean, Bradley's not 100% sold on the label idealist anyway. And usually it's one of these things that people, I think, who think really deeply about things are not really concerned about the label. In fact, they usually don't really like the label because it means that people miss the nuance. So Bradley doesn't really call it mind. He calls it sentience or spirit, spirit following Hegel. But then he's equally clear that he is not like Hegel. He's not a Hegelian because he finds Hegel's conception of the nature of the absolute far too limiting. I wish I should probably have prepared by grabbing a couple of the books so I could give you the exact quotes. So instead I'm going to butcher them for you.
Go for it.
He basically says in the introduction to Appearance and Reality, I believe, that he doesn't consider himself a Hegelian. He couldn't be a Hegelian because he doesn't accept what he takes to be Hegel's core doctrine. Now, Hegel's core doctrine is that reality is ultimately thought. It's to do with his system of logic. It's to do with the unfolding of reality according to dialectic logical principles. Bradley thinks he has this beautiful paragraph that at the time was called one of the most beautiful things ever spoken in the English language. And he says, the idea that reality is... I'm not going to risk butchering such a beautiful thing. You can look it up. Basically, what he says is that the idea that reality is just thought, to him, is as cold and off-putting as the idea that it's purely material. So he says that, no, we have to understand reality as experience, where we have a much broader conception of what experience is. It's not just thought. It includes feeling. It includes willing, volition, which is the stuff I was trying to say to you. Thought is that givenness, that conscious experience, not just your cognitive processes. It's also the draws and the desires and the pulls. For Bradley, it includes your pleasures and your pains and your hopes and your dreams. But all of these things are aspects of human experience. There's nothing, we can't even coherently make sense of anything that isn't rooted in human experience. So I'll give you some examples of the sorts of things that I think I would just dismiss as ridiculous. That space-time is curved. I mean, I understand Einstein's theories, right? I did a maths degree as well. I mean, I've looked at some of the mathematics of this stuff. I understand why he says space is curved. It makes the maths much better. You're defining what a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points and so on. When you do that, then you end up with having to say, as speed of light is a constant and it takes the shortest path, that space is curved. But then if you translate that idea that only to me makes sense within the context of the mathematics of relativity theory, and you say that this thing here in which we live, move and have our being is curved, I don't even know what that means. I can't make sense.
Yeah.
Only inside. So what you would do then is to say, that's thought. That's part of thought experience. And it could be a very helpful, good kind of thought experience, but it doesn't immediately make it more real than a felt experience. Now, how about I talk to you, you talk to me? Well, what more is there in that than the sounds that you're hearing right now, the thoughts that those sounds elicit, your cognitive processing of those thoughts, and your movement of your mouth through your will, that then means that I'm now hearing sounds and doing a cognitive process and through an act of will, making my tongue move. That's the full story. There doesn't need to be any further story about anything going on outside of what we could conceive of as an experience.
I want to try and get to visualize exactly, because I've got many different ways of interpreting what you're saying. So I just want to see if I can get as close to it as I possibly can. And I might ask questions from a point of view that might not necessarily be my own. But for example, say that the cognitive mind as we experience it on this planet began with this planet. What existed prior to the thinking animal? What was the mind that existed then?
So I think this might be touching on something that you mentioned before that I didn't talk about, which is whether we think about the absolute as eternal. I think that for Bradley, time was what he calls an appearance, and so it's not part of reality. However, I don't think I would agree with that. I think that
are appearances not a part of reality?
Well, they are actually.
Yeah.
When you read philosophers that aren't trying to be scientific in the way they explain things, I mean, still rigorous, but they're not part of that analytic tradition emerged in the early 20th century. They're happy to walk you through in a narrative way a series of thoughts where your thinking at the beginning might be very helpful initially because it connects with your intuitive or naive conceptions of things, and then that sort of idea comes apart towards the end and you recognize that you need to update what you said earlier. But I mean, it's not. Wittgenstein does the same thing when he throws a ladder away at the end of No, sorry. Okay, I think maybe it's philosophy. One of them he talks about a ladder, the other talks about passing over in silence. Silence is traffic. Okay. So initially Bradley starts with this very intuitive idea that we early on recognize a difference between appearance and reality. And we encounter that when we have like visual illusions or it appears to be one thing, but actually on closer inspection, it isn't. And we recognize that. For example, trees in the distance are not actually smaller than my thumb. Things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we learn then to compensate for the kind of incoherences of our felt experience through restructuring things in thought. Okay. So that immediately separates between appearance and reality. But then what he does is he turns and looks at various concepts we use to make sense of the world. Causation, activity, time, space, and so on. Relations and objects and things, and says we have this idea of what it is to be time, we have this idea of what it is to be space, and so on. And then he said, though that's an incoherent notion, that space tries to be both infinitely divisible and unbounded, and that's incoherent. And so he says, so these things must be appearance and not reality. Admits that these are practical ways in which we try to make sense of the world, but we can't take this.
What was incoherent again? Sorry. The idea that space is unbound.
So his most famous one, which he then applies to these other things, is relations and objects. So he says a relation is supposed to unite its terms, but also to separate them. So the cat sat on the mat. What is this sitting relation? Well, the sitting relation is what distinguishes the cat from the mat, because they are not the same thing, because one is sitting on the other. And yet the sitting relation is what allows the mat and the cat to be part of the same kind of space or field. Yeah. And then he says, okay, so how is this supposed to work? Do we first have the cat and the mat, and then we try to add some sort of sitting thing? And he says, well, that doesn't work. And then he looks at the sittingness and then says, well, we can't just have sittingness by itself and think that creates the two. So what he shows is basically that terms depend on their relation for their being. The relation depends on the terms for its being. So these things can't be independent of one another. They have to be ways in which we abstract from a whole bits and sort of try to then recapture how they could be. But when we very carefully look at it, we can't have them doing all things at once. So he basically has a regress. Like, well, what is it that connects them the sitting with the mat? We need another relation in there. If the relation is nothing but its relatedness, then where do the terms come from? So there's always this sort of issue of priority, which comes first. And he uses the same thing with say, time. Time is supposed to be infinitely divisible. There is a point in the present, and there can be no lapse in time. I mean, I need to really see. He's not very good at exactly spelling out the arguments, but when you sit and think about them, you can kind of see that our conception of time is a bit incoherent. Now, actually, McTaggart, who's another British idealist, wrote a paper far clearer, showing how it's contradictory.
I've read that paper.
Yeah. So he says at the beginning of that paper that he's picking up Bradley's ideas, but I think he's making them a little bit clearer. That this is an aside, but it's a funny one. There's a guy, C.D. Broad, at the time, who said of Hegel, Bradley, and McTaggart, for anyone who've read them, you'll get it. He says if Hegel was the mysterious and often inchoate prophet of the absolute, and if Bradley was its chivalrous knight, then McTaggart was its very, very precise family lawyer or something. You get this sort of idea. You know, Bradley's all kind of gung-ho and very romantic in his ideas of the absolute, and all the goodness comes together, and, you know, evil finds its place and is overcome by the good and all this stuff. I love it. Very romantic, though.
Yeah.
Hegel's almost impenetrable, and McTaggart, sort of gets down and does the sums of this stuff, right? But the idea is then that time is contradictory. And that is a major view philosophically. I think the idea that time flows is intellectually incoherent. Now, my reply to this is that just shows that time is not part of thought, that we cannot properly capture time in thought. We cannot properly capture time in our models. The best thing we have is space-time of, say, Einstein's theories, which models it as a dimension in space. Great,
so
that's a great way to model it.
Time is not a part of thought.
Time is not fundamentally a part of thought, right? Exactly. And that's the.
So that sounds very opposite to something like it escapes me at the moment. But the idea, like even the phenomenologists, they often talk of time having this sort of pushing and pulling quality that is part of the subject, that's part of what our thinking is, that it is a duration. Bergson, that was the name I was trying to come up with. That seems to be almost opposite like a Bergson way of thinking, because the way the shape of the mind, the shape of this duration is what it is. Like it is purely like that's what time is, rather than saying that time is not a part of thought. Is that what you said? Time is not an element of thought. I would assume they would say the complete opposite, that time is entirely thought.
And so we might not be saying different things. I don't know Bergson, but what I mean by that is that if you have, and you recognize that these are not hard and fast distinctions, obviously, but if you recognize that we can usefully discuss kind of a three areas of human experience and think about them differently with certain emphasis. One would be the area of thought, the other is the area of feeling, and the other is the area of volition or willing. Then you can think about things related to willing and volition, or think about things related to feeling, but you're never going to quite capture it. You're never going to be able to quite nail it with your concepts. And I think that time is something we're acquainted with through action, through doing things. So it's more in the realm of volition or willing. Now, of course, the act of thinking or the act of judging is an act. And that takes place as an act of will, as an act in time. But the content of thought and the modeling of thought, when we're engaged in logic, for example, we tend to take these propositions as timeless, as applicable at all times. 2 + 2 is 4 is eternal. It's an eternal truth. There's something eternal about that. Now, what is it about logical claims and mathematical claims that give them this seemingly eternal status? For me, it's because they're thinking about thinking. Their thoughts about thought. Mathematics is a way of thinking about the structures of thought itself. It's reason turning in on itself.
This is Platonic way of thinking. Would that be?
Will it be Platonic?
Yeah.
It'd be a Platonic way of thinking if you then started to assume that that's where reality is.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, when you're starting to theorize about the world, excuse me, scientifically or otherwise, yeah, you're going to need to model time as an element within your system. Maybe it's a dimension and you can just move backwards and forwards. Time is no different to space. It's just another quantity in your thought. And I think that's the right way to do it. So I'd be an eternalist about time if I'm trying to capture time intellectually in thinking. However, that's not where I butt up against time. That's not the root experience of time I have. The root experience of time I have is going to sleep, waking up in the morning, deciding what to eat for breakfast, looking at my clock, coming here for 9 o'clock. So time is fundamentally encountered as the fundamental aspect of willing and doing things and acting, not as the fundamental aspect of thought. So we can try to capture that in thought, but when we always miss out on the flow aspect, the difference between the present and the past and the future. And that's what McTaggart was pointing out. Yeah. If you try to get notions of presentness, pastness, and futureness into your model of time, you end up in a contradictory situation. Now, but the answer to me isn't to say, therefore, time isn't real. The answer to say is that time is too real, it's too fundamental to be captured in thought, because thought is not the root place where time is.
So taking that, because the reason we got into that was to try and understand this world before earthly minds. The man on the street wants to know, what is that world relative? Whose mind is that happening in? Where is that mind? Now, is that happening in our mind from our perspective, or is that happening in a broader meta mind?
So it's certainly happening. It's certainly happening in our minds, right? It's happening in our thoughts, because that's how we know about it. That's how we talk about it. That's how the scientists came up with it. So it's certainly an aspect of thought, right? And then really, whether you think there's an additional story to tell will depend on how comfortable you are with notions of the absolute as a feeling thing, or God, or if you're someone like McTaggart, you sort of don't think that there's anything beyond the community of souls, which would be, say, humans. So there are atheist and theist versions of idealism, and then there are some that are like, say, castrups, which seem to be some kind of impersonal unification.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of making sense of that. I mean, I'm a theist. For me, then I don't, but that doesn't mean that I think there was this real world. I don't know whether God saw, evolution unfold, or anything of that sort. And I don't, whether God thought about it. The difficulty is once you're starting to talk about the absolute of God, you really lose a grip on what it is like to be Godness, which is often in philosophy of mind a way of trying to get a sense on human experience. It's what is it like to be Sean? What is it like to be Nathan, right? I can have a bit of an idea what it is like to be Sean, a bit, right? Because we're male, we each have family, and I've been to Australia. It's not like it's some completely foreign culture.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah.
Do I know what it is like to be my wife? Well, she's a woman. That's quite different. But we've shared a lot of experience together. But by the time, what is it like to be a frog? Oh gosh, goodness me, I don't really know. But now you say, what is it like to be God? I believe there is what it is like to be God. That's the whole point, I think, of saying my idealism, if I were to sort of distill it into a slogan, is that the deep nature of reality is more like a person than like a machine. I think really that's what it comes down to. But person needs to be understood as in what I understand to be a person extrapolated to infinity, rather than what I think the likes of Castrup do, which is take what it is to be a person and kind of remove the cognitive, metacognitive bits, right? You end up with something a bit more like a newt, but taking up the whole of reality. And this is where Bradley ends up. He says that we should not call reality personal, but super personal, and more. It involves the entirety of sentience, every, pleasure, pain, desire, will, beauty, the whole lot is in there. But there's no matter. I mean, what's matter? I can't even make sense of what matter is. Matter is supposed to be something that is entirely self-subsistent and can exist independent of its qualities and so on. One other little thing I will say, just to cement what we talked about before. So I'm not going to say I'm a massive expert on this, I'm not. But from my understanding, a lot of philosophy of science is moving away from this idea of matter anyway, and moving towards something called a powers ontology, which is that everything is understood now in terms of fields, and fields are fields of potential that have what's called dispositional qualities. So the classic example is a glass is fragile, which is a dispositional quality. It means that under certain forces it will shatter and break. But the idea would be that if the glass never shatters, it still was always fragile. So it had the dispositional property even if it never manifests. So what is a dispositional quality? It means that under certain conditions, it will affect the quality, the properties of itself and other things. But if you take that idea, which works really nicely in the maths from my understanding, and you explain things like charge and mass and spin and all these other kinds of fundamental properties in physics, and you say these are all dispositions. What is it to have a charge? It's the disposition to affect things that other fields that pass through it in this way according to the numbers. So it's all functions in mathematics.
Yeah.
Input this, you output that. If that's where you get to this, what I think of is the insane position, saying everything is just numbers. What you mean is everything is just functions. Everything is the potential to affect, potentials to affect, potentials to affect, potentials to affect. But none of that is ever cashed out in anything. No. There is no nature of anything at all. There is no thing.
There is no thingness. Yeah, that's right.
Purely structural, purely relational.
But if that's the case, if that's what physicality is in terms of the modern physics, then that's what the physical world should be in these models. I don't think that that's a problem because, as you're saying, there's no thingness. We end up with this model where it's all just relations and it's all just if I look at this thing and this relates to this thing, and as long as I keep it contained to this frame of reference, then we start being able to talk about it coherently. But there's no substance. There's no absolute particles or objects that are actually doing anything. But if that's what it is, if that's what it's proven to be, if that's the modern interpretation, then can't we then say that manifold of happenings is what we're talking about, and that is what is happening? That's an aspect of mind. Like if it's mind, if mind is the fundamental primitive, and these are the relationships that we can measure, and these are the things that we can have truth statements about, then is that not physicality within the idealist model? Can't we have both of them, and we just refer to mind when we refer to mind, and we refer to material when we refer to material, knowing that neither of them are absolute terms?
Well, okay, so I mean, you can call things whatever you want as long as you know what you mean by them, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is that what happens is, so let's take this powers ontology thing. In some ways, I want to say, my instinct is to say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That actually, rather than the standard model idea or the stuff you get from high school where you think about atoms like billiard balls or something, instead now we're saying these are just fields of numbers with functions on them, and all they do is spit out things based on their inputs. That's a purely relational or structural. But that's not what powers ontology is. Powers ontology says this is the way we model things. So that is what is. The ontology bit is saying that's what there is. So reality just is numbers, or reality just is powers. And this point I'm wanting to, again, call BS. Like basically that is falling into the same thing that Hegel fell into and scientism falls into, which is saying that if this is our theory, that's how things are. Or if this is how we best ought to think about things, that is what reality is. Well, reality is more than thought. Reality is more than your theory. Reality is more than the entities in that theory. Reality is more than your language. Reality is more than your thought. We encounter it every day in feeling, the world that hits us in the face constantly, in including things like colors, tastes, smells, and sounds, and so on, as well as our entire world of acting and living and being in the world, which is to me linked with questions concerning meaning and morality and all of that sort of stuff.
We can't let go of any of that stuff.
Yeah, the value of my kids and all that sort of stuff.
It's all part of the tapestry.
My 2-month-old daughter is not just numbers. I mean, that is, if you think
no, she's not just numbers. That's 100% right. But there is a what I'm saying is that there is a manifold of, like, there's a truth to the fact of the numbers that is your daughter. That exists as much as redness does or love does, or like, it's there as well. It's part of the tapestry. To say that it's the only thing that's there, I agree, is wrong. To say that it is the fundamental thing that's there is also wrong. But to say that it's less real than my feeling, it's like, no, that's one of the feelings. It's just we've broken it down into parts and we're talking about it in a mathematical sense. It's still there. Like, there's still a truth to it, but the truth arises from the first person perspective, like everything does, like anything that we can talk about seems to.
Yeah, right. So it exists in thought, it exists in language, it exists descriptively. But I think, and if you're the sort of person that thinks that that's where the action is, the action's in thought, which is the kind of thing that intellectuals and academics are prone to think, because that's the thing that they deal with the whole time. But I think that what I learned to appreciate with Bradley is his humility about the limits of philosophy, the limits of rationality, the limits of thought, right? Which is unusual for a philosopher. He starts in his introduction basically saying that there's nothing special about doing philosophy. It's not some magical gateway to truth. He thinks you can understand reality just as well by painting pictures and making music, something you do, by engaging with it aesthetically, or engaging with it morally in terms of, going to charity and going overseas, or whatever you happen to do, whatever you think is a moral way to live. That these are all just as legitimate ways of forms of knowledge about reality. He's not like most philosophers are, who thinks propositional knowledge of facts, knowledge that we can assert beliefs are some kind of special knowledge. No, we know the world through interacting with it. We also know the world through feeling it. Now, maybe what you want to resist is the additional one, where he says there are degrees of reality, where there are degrees of truth, and he thinks that we encounter far more the nature of reality through feeling. Yeah. That's where we encounter the kind of solidity of reality.
That would be the point where I would push back, the idea of degrees. And thought is far more abstract,
and he thinks abstraction is removing from the thatness, the existence quality.
Okay.
Now, I am sympathetic to that view in that we are far less deceived or wrong in our senses, I think. We're in fact, some ways, it seems that, like, ever since Berkeley as well, there's something more certain about our sense experiences. Not maybe that reality is that way, but that we are having those sense experiences. I can't really deny that I am experiencing some red pixels from your t-shirt on my screen. I am having that experience. Even if it turns out you've put some really fancy filter and you're wearing,
it's blue. Yeah,
and you're wearing a blue shirt.
Yeah,
it doesn't. But I could be wrong about the color of your shirt in terms of what you're experiencing, but not in terms of what I'm experiencing. But my thinking is far less. There's far less certainty in the things that I think. I recognize that comes apart. So what he thinks is that when we engage in thought, we're engaging then with contents. Thought is superior to feeling in that it allows us to transcend the horizon, transcend the present moment, etc. It allows us to construct a far bigger and grander world, but at the cost of the thatness, the reality of it. And that actually then these two need to come together. That's what absolute experience is. Absolute experience is in the coming together of thought and feeling. And so he thinks the content of thought regains its being when it's fully comprehensive, fully coherent. So I think there's something in that. I can also see why somebody who thinks, no, you're being too mean to thought. But it seems to me that it's part of the
dynamic of any time I see hierarchy in any sense, I'm like, to what end is this hierarchy going this way or that? because any time that we're saying this is, as we were saying before with life forms, there's a higher beings, lower beings. It's like, no, there's beings. There's beings from points of view, and the points of view are infinite in potential. But to say that one type of something is more so than the other is probably going to miss something.
It possibly, although I think though, for me and for Bradley, it's more an issue of genesis, in that we do seem to experience the world in this immediate, direct way first before we then think about it. And our thinking about the world seems to be constrained by the way we feel the world. So we can't really conceive of a color that's not within the spectrum of our experience. The source of the content of our thought life is drawn from that immediate encounter we have in feeling. And then from there, it can become highly abstract until we start talking about things like curved space. But as I say, then you're just really interpreting numbers. You can't really conceive of what that is.
Yeah.
So there is something that means that thought seems parasitic on feeling in a way that is not the reverse. You could experience something you'd never experienced before. We encounter that all the time. It can be thrilling, right, and exciting. And then you learn, this thought catches up. And then you have to interpret it and make sense of it, and then figure out how that could work and re-update your thinking. So is that a hierarchy? I don't know, but I think there's something to be said there, and that you can then talk about that gets sort of wrongly flipped around when you start to do the kinds of things saying, this is what we've discovered is the best way of thinking about the world, is in terms of powers and dispositions. Therefore, that's all there is. Everything is numbers. You might think you're feeling this stuff or encountering this world, but that's all an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion, blah, blah, blah. For me, that's just where things go wrong. And it also does strip out, which I think we're seeing culturally, strips out meaning, strips out notions of free will and all of that sort of stuff. And it's leading to, as well, bizarre conclusions like, oh yeah, AI should have rights. You shouldn't be allowed to unplug your computer at night, and kind of all this sort of stuff. I'm thinking, okay, you start to lose the plot when you're interpreting everything too much in terms of the numbers and the machines. It's all just information and so on. Well, you're going to go ethically nuts. In my opinion.
We've killed God.
The root of it is metaphysics. I think the root is metaphysics.
We killed God, and now we're paying the price.
Well, there is that. Yeah, there definitely is that. I think what
there's a modern nihilism. There is a modern nihilism that's coming as a result of the scientific revolution, the 20th century revolution in particular, and that's going to take a while to play out. Like we're still pretty close to that moment. You know, the whole quantum mechanics, relativity. That was a real massive hand grenade culturally, and just prior to that was the discovery that we lived in a galaxy, and that galaxy was among many other galaxies. So our way of looking at the world is constantly changing, and we can see the turbulence at the moment. But I think that the shock wave that began in 1905 is not yet flattened out, and I think we are in that point of nihilism at the moment, for the reasons that you've already pointed out. And I think that maybe philosophers need to be more entertaining. That's your job.
I'm trying. The difficulty is to try to do philosophy that you think is done properly and rigorously, but in a way that is understandable. And it's quite a difficult thing to match, especially when you're coming at things, as I am, from a less intuitive way. You kind of need to over-justify that, you know, I'm not an idiot. I actually know a bit about the science, and I, do maths. It's not that I'm completely ignorant and just spouting off from some kind of fundamentalist point of view. But also, to make it stick. So you have to kind of start with knowing the way people see the world already, and then try to invite them to see things a bit differently. And some of the problem is that I've been in the academic world now for a number of years. I forget what most people do and don't know. So I'll use terms that for me mean something, and they don't necessarily mean that for other people, and they think I'm saying something different. or I'm assuming this, or I don't realize that people see the world completely differently, because you do get quite isolated. I'm trying to avoid that, but but I definitely 100% think that philosophy has the capacity to play the role religion used to play. I mean, I am religious myself, but I just think that the way in which it was done, where it's because the Bible tells me so, or something along those lines, that's just not going to work, because that's not where people give any credence to. So you need to be able to speak a language that's not rooted in that. And similarly, I found that a lot of the terms and words that we used and have been understood in culture that were based in religious conceptions, people don't really even know what they mean. I mean, they've heard of the word like sin, righteousness, salvation, grace, or whatever, but it's not like they're natural words for them. And there's no point us trying to say, okay, this is what these words mean, and then use them. You're better to just use words that can be understood. That's what philosophy does, I think. You can talk about meaning and ethics and the deep nature of things and all this stuff without deploying religious language. And I find it far better, personally,
I think that we're all quite hungry for meaning again. So I've taken up heaps of your time. We went through idealism. You definitely reshuffled my take in terms of going from a popular catstrap way of looking at things towards Bradley. I'm going to have to get out my copy of Appearance and Reality. That's the book, isn't it? That's the one to go to. I'll have to get that out again.
That's his metaphysical book, yeah.
I will get that out again and attack it again. I only got a little bit of the way through it before I got distracted, but a lot of what you said resonated strongly, and I did try and come at it from that different angle, but yes, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. To all the people who are still watching, make sure that you head over to Nathan's page. I've changed gears again. Nathan Hawkins on YouTube. It was a pleasure. It was terrifying. It was great. I love jumping into the deep end with lecturers when little old musical Sean here just trying to make things work.
It's a pleasure talking to you, Sean.
All right. Well, thank you. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Maybe. Yeah.